Good evening, everyone. We'll just give some people a few more minutes to start trickling in. And we'll probably just give people about one more minute to join in here. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for a workshop about intervening in a Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission hearing. This webinar is co-hosted by the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or SLAA, and the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, or CREDNB. My name is Crystal Ann Roussel, and I'm a staff lawyer at SLAA and the Water Policy Coordinator for their Healthy Great Lakes program. I'm based in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Carrie Blaze, SLAA's Northern Services Council, and Teresa McClenahan, SLAA's Executive Director and Legal Counsel. So I just have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. First, we have set this up as a Zoom meeting, which means you do have control over your camera and your mic. However, we do ask that you please keep yourselves muted to limit any background noise until we get to the Q&A portion of the workshop in about 45 minutes time. Second, we are recording the session for those who can't join us live, and it will be posted on our website along with the slides and an information package that includes some key information and links from this presentation. So please keep in mind that it is a public session, so anyone is welcome. We will turn the recording off for the Q&A portion. So today's workshop came about as a result of the upcoming relicensing hearing for the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station in New Brunswick. In anticipation of the public commission hearing for this project, CREDNB and several members of the public requested that we host this workshop to help walk folks through the process and timeline for participating in a nuclear licensing hearing. As such, the workshop will include specific information related to the upcoming Point Lepreau hearing, but it will also include general information about intervening in a CNSC hearing, which can be applied more broadly. In terms of a brief agenda, we'll start by speaking to the importance of environmental justice and public participation. Then we'll provide a brief overview of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So who are they? What is their role? We'll then provide an overview of the Point Lepreau license renewal application, what they're asking for, and what CNSC staff are recommending. Finally, we'll move on to a discussion of the actual hearing process. So we'll go over the timeline and process for participating, how to prepare your intervention, and preparing for the hearing itself. And then at the end of today's session, we'll have some time for a Q&A. So before we get started, I just want to spend a little time telling you about the hosts of today's workshop, SLAA and CredNB. So a bit about SLAA. The Canadian Environmental Law Association is a public interest law organization dedicated to environmental equity, justice, and health. It was founded in 1970, and we're an environmental legal aid clinic providing free legal services to low-income people and disadvantaged communities with financial support from Legal Aid Ontario. SLAA represents clients and provides public legal education on a range of issues aimed at protecting human health, air, land, water, and nature. So our services include direct representation of eligible clients in proceedings, in trial or appellate courts and before administrative tribunals, test cases, summary advice, public legal education, and law reform. SLAA places high priority on cases and law reform work aimed at ensuring access to environmental justice and ensuring safe, healthy, and livable communities. And we are Ontario's only clinic providing environmental law legal aid services throughout the province. And a bit about CredNB. The Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick is a coalition of citizens groups and individuals from across New Brunswick. CredNB advocates for responsible, renewable, nuclear-free energy development in New Brunswick that will address the climate crisis. CredNB represents citizens groups and individuals living across New Brunswick who will be affected by the proposed license renewal for Point Lepreau and who have concerns about the health, safety, and environmental impacts of such a renewal. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie for part one of our presentation.
Thanks, Crystal, and good evening, everyone. So to start things off this evening, we're going to begin by unpacking a phrase that many of you are probably familiar with, the phrase of environmental justice. So what is it and how does it relate to participating in a nuclear licensing hearing? So put simply, environmental justice is this idea that when everyone can meaningfully participate, no group, no individual, no community should be affected inequitably by the outcome or the decision. However, there's a number of systemic barriers that prevent true and equal participation. This can be caused by the difficulties in engagement. It takes time, it takes resources. Perhaps you're volunteering your time to participate. And there's inherent power differentials too, where some participants in the decision-making process are financially well-equipped. They have the capacity for communications or promotion, and technical review and studies, and can send many of their staff to participate in the decision-making process. In this instance, it's a nuclear licensing hearing. So as a result, we need to continue to push for more fair processes that make up for these differentials. But it does mean that there will be voices who are underrepresented in decision-making. And so it's in this context that environmental injustices can arise. And these inequities become entrenched within that decision. And so there's a compelling need for communities who stand to be most affected to do what they can to participate, to engage, despite recognizing many of these barriers and access to justice that stand in the way. So within the principle of environmental justice, there's also a number of procedural dimensions. And so environmental justice, advocating for environmental justice actually provides a solution to what we're looking for. So for instance, environmental justice calls for all persons to have an opportunity to meaningfully participate in all aspects of government decision-making where that decision could affect your health or your environment. And environmental justice also stands for the right and the principle that anyone engaged in that decision have access to timely and full and thorough information such that you are an equal participant within that decision-making process. And so, more simply put, this is the right to participate and the right to know, which we've highlighted in this slide. And so if we're truly to advance environmental justice and reverse the trend where those who have the least power are most detrimentally affected by a decision, public participation provides that immediate starting point. And public participation, it's a two-way dialogue. And so, yes, it provides you an opportunity to share what concerns you directly with the decision maker, but it also provides that government decision maker with the input they need to consider the public's interest. And in the end, what results is a decision that enhances democracy and the legitimacy of that decision. And it can lead to greater accountability and effectiveness as well, because now when you address a decision maker and you share your concerns, that decision maker must show how they considered your views, your concerns, and your comments in their deliberations, in their reasoning, and in their analysis. And the last point on this slide is maybe a reminder also that participating in a nuclear licensing hearing might be one of your few ways of actually participating in decision-making processes. And we will get to it a bit later on in our presentation, but there is no environmental assessment hearing for this matter or impact assessment. And so at this point in time, if you are looking to directly address the decision maker, so the person, or sorry, the body who is granting the decision to grant a license or deny a license, that is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And so there is no other process or parallel process. And so we're glad you joined us this evening so we can walk you through how you can participate in the upcoming hearing. So we're going to now turn to some of the more technical details of how you will go about participating in a nuclear licensing process. So to begin, we'll start by asking, who is Canada's nuclear safety regulator? So there's a number of names to become familiar with, and we've tried to summarize them on this slide. So the Commission, or more fully known, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they are an independent quasi-judicial administrative tribunal. They are a court of record, which means they have an open process, and they were established by a statute called the Nuclear Safety and Control Act in 2000. Excuse me. So, sorry, the commission has a staff as well. So the commission is comprised of staff members, and there's 800 employees that review the licenses, that review whether they're compliant with regulatory requirements, and the staff make a recommendation to the commission, who is the tribunal, on whether or not the license is complete, if the license application has deficiencies, and if it's compliant with the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. There's also the licensee. So in this case, that's New Brunswick Power, or NB Power for short. And they are the proponent or the licensee for this nuclear licensing matter. So I think it's important to note from the outset, you want to try and wrap your mind around three distinct bodies. There's the commission, who is the tribunal, who you may appear before. They have staff, the CNSC staff, and then there's the licensee, who is New Brunswick Power. All right, so focusing in on who is the CNSC as a tribunal, as the commission, as the body that is making this decision. So ultimately, they must function in a way that aligns with the purposes that are set out in the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. And we recognize this is a lot of information to digest in just an hour and a half. And so we've put the information on these slides, so you can always come back and refer to it later. So the Nuclear Safety and Control Act sets out the purpose of the CNSC, and we've kind of underlined the most crucial parts. So the purpose of the Act, which defines how the CNSC functions, is to limit in a reasonable level actions that are compliant with Canada's international obligations, and to ensure the health and safety of persons in the environment, in ways that are associated with the development, production, use of nuclear energy, the production, the possession of nuclear substances, and also the prescribed equipment. So anything to do with nuclear production, operations, safety, control, that is within the purview of the CNSC. And the CNSC also has as its purpose the implementation of measures which Canada has agreed to in the international sphere relating to the development and production of nuclear energy, including non-proliferation agreements and commitments. And then the Nuclear Safety Control Act also sets out the powers of the CNSC as a tribunal, so as a statutory body. And so no tribunal has unlimited powers. And for the CNSC, their powers are granted by statute. So they have to stay within their powers as granted under the Act. And so these powers, we've put them up on the slide. So the objects that the Commission must fulfill, it's to regulate the development, production, and use of nuclear energy. And in so doing, they must prevent unreasonable risk to the environment, to the health and safety of persons. They also must achieve conformity, again, with international obligations. And they also have, as one of their purposes and powers, to disseminate scientific information to the public. And a lot of the language we see in the powers of the tribunal are reflected also in the purpose statement that I just showed you on the last slide, which is a purpose for the entire Act as itself. So definitely important provisions to keep in mind. And the final section I'll share with you are the powers specific to licensing. So we've kind of gone from broad, the purposes under the Nuclear Safety Control Act, then we zoomed in on the powers of the Commission, and now we're looking at specifically in the licensing context, what can the Commission do? So for licensing, it's under Section 24 of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, and again, copied here on this slide so you can refer to it later. But it states that no license shall be issued, amended, replaced, renewed, unless the licensee has demonstrated that they are qualified to carry on the activity in a way that makes adequate provision for the protection of the environment, the health and safety of persons, and maintains, again, the implementation of international obligations. So the good news is there's three themes that emerge from the reading of the Act, which is the protection of human health, the environment, and the upholding of international obligations. And so we point you to these provisions because they will ultimately inform how you address the Commission and how you understand what they can and cannot do. So within this context, we're jumping in kind of midway in the process. So the CNSC can issue licenses for a range of things. Had this been a new facility, they would grant, or they would consider granting a site preparation license, and then a construction license, and then an operation license. And that's where we now find ourselves. So Point Lepreau Nuclear Generating Station is an operating nuclear power plant. And what NB Power is seeking is a renewal of their operating license. You can see on this slide that the CNSC also has the power to issue decommissioning licenses. So that's after operations, and also the authority to release a facility from control, which would be a license to abandon. Just some context so you know where this fits within the larger picture. I just want to flag that tonight we're talking about a nuclear licensing hearing, but some of you may wonder, you know, for a significant activity like relicensing a nuclear power plant or the waste management facility at Point Lepreau, you know, is there an environmental assessment? In some instances, an impact or environmental assessment may be required prior to a license being granted. And perhaps some of you know that impact assessment is a phenomenal tool for actually identifying, predicting, evaluating, and mitigating those social, environmental, and human health impacts before a project is decided. And likewise, you know, in impact assessment, it's a multi-stage process. It goes on for many, many months, and the public can weigh in at multiple stages, not just one point. Unfortunately, under Canada's Federal Impact Assessment Act, the renewal of a nuclear license for a nuclear power plant does not require an environmental assessment. Granting a decommissioning license, so if we're thinking down the road, that doesn't require an environmental assessment. Also, a license to construct a small modular reactor at the Point Lepreau site, that also would not require an impact or environmental assessment. So I just raised this to show that we are confined to participating in the CNSC licensing process as set out under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. This is a regulatory proceeding. It's more narrow than an impact assessment, because again, we're also being narrowed to that that stage of being at the operations stage. It's not site preparation, it's not decommissioning. We're looking squarely at operations. And the point being to measure if there is unreasonable risk to human health and the environment, again, as set out under the Act. So to recap that kind of who's who, so the CNSC, as we can short form their name, they are Canada's nuclear regulator. Among its powers is being able to issue licenses for nuclear facilities, and nuclear facilities include nuclear power plants. However, when the CNSC makes a decision, it has to conform to a number of things. So we can look to the purposes of the Act as set out in Section 3, the objects of the Commission themselves as a tribunal, what they must do, and also the licensing parameters that are set out under the Act. And so with that kind of introduction into the CNSC and nuclear licensing, I will now pass it back to Crystal.
Thanks, Carrie. So I'll just spend a little bit of time providing an overview of the Point Lepreau license renewal application. Thanks, Carrie. So NB Power currently has a 5-year operating license for the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station, which expires on June 30th of this year. In terms of some background, Point Lepreau is the only nuclear power plant in Atlantic Canada, and the Point Lepreau site is located on the Lepreau Peninsula on the northern shore of the Bay of Fundy, which is just about 40 kilometers southwest of St. John. The Point Lepreau site consists of a single refurbished CANDU 6 pressurized heavy water reactor and a solid radioactive waste management facility. The current license for Point Lepreau is a consolidated license for both the reactor and the waste management facility. So what is NB Power asking for in terms of license renewal? NB Power has submitted an application to renew the current power reactor operating license for Point Lepreau for a period of 25 years until 2047. Next slide, please. So in response to NB Power's application, CNSC staff have submitted a report with conclusions and recommendations to help inform the Commission's decision on the license application. In terms of what they are recommending, first, they've recommended that the Commission renew the Point Lepreau license, authorizing NB Power to carry out the licensed activities for 20 years instead of 25 years, from July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2042. The licensed activities will not change between Point Lepreau's current license and the renewed license. And these include operating the nuclear facility and the waste management facility, possessing, transferring, using, storing the nuclear substances that are required for or associated with the licensed activities, and transporting Category 2 nuclear material by road vehicle from the nuclear facility spent fuel bay to the on-site waste storage facility. So as I said, CNSC staff have recommended a 20-year license term as opposed to the 25-year term proposed by NB Power, because they suggest that this more closely aligns with end-of-life decisions for the facility. So the Point Lepreau facility was refurbished back in 2012, which extended the life of the plant until 2042. So CNSC staff highlight that a 25-year license extends past this time frame, and as such, a 20-year term is more appropriate. It is worth noting that historically, the Commission granted licenses for a duration of up to 10 years, with the standard up until very recently being 3 to 5 year licenses. So we'll go over the problems with the proposed license length in more detail later on, but a 20 to 25 year license would be unprecedented in Canada. CNSC staff claim that the longer license is justified in part because the CNSC has made significant improvements to its regulatory framework and regulatory oversight practices over the years. And then the second recommendation from CNSC staff is that the Commission accept NB Power's 2020 preliminary decommissioning plan and associated financial guarantee. So NB Power's preliminary decommissioning plan was recently updated in 2020, and it essentially sets out a detailed plan and cost estimate for the acceptance and transfer of all Point Lepreau irradiated fuel no later than the year 2067. And the total value of NB Power's financial guarantee was $755 million against a funding requirement of $714.5 million. So these CNSC staff recommendations, along with NB Power's submissions and the submissions of any interveners, will be considered by the Commission at the public hearing and before making a decision on the license application. Next slide. So what exactly is the process and timeline for participating in the upcoming Point Lepreau license renewal hearing before the CNSC? The hearing process begins when a proponent files a license application. In this case, it was a license renewal application by NB Power, and this was submitted on June 2021, and you can find it online. We have a link on the slide here. The public hearing process is divided into two parts. So part one allows the CNSC staff and NB Power to present to the Commission, while part two allows the public to address the Commission. So part one occurred already on January 26th, and transcripts of the event are now available on the CNSC's website, and I believe you can rewatch the recording as well. Part two will take place on May 11th and 12th, and this is when you will have a chance, if you choose to address the Commission. So later in the workshop, we'll go through how to request to appear before the Commission and how to prepare. So once the public hearing has occurred, the Commission will deliberate and issue a decision before the current license expires. So since the current license for Point Lepreau expires on June 30th, we can expect a decision sometime before that date. Next slide, please. So if you decide you want to participate in the hearing, these are the key dates you will want to remember. So March 28th is the deadline for submitting written comments or interventions to the CNSC. It is also the deadline for you to make a request if you would like to make an oral intervention or a presentation at the hearing. The next important deadline is going to happen somewhere around April 27th. This is the deadline for you to submit a presentation to the CNSC if you requested to and are given permission to make an oral intervention. This deadline is still to be confirmed, but it is usually about 2 weeks prior to the hearing date. Which brings me to the final set of dates here. Part two of the CNSC hearing again will take place on May 11th and 12th, and this is when you have a chance to make an oral presentation if you so choose. So in terms of how you can participate in the hearing, we've been using the terms intervener and intervention a lot in this presentation, but what exactly does that mean? According to the CNSC, interveners are members of the public or organizations who have an interest or expertise in the matter who have requested the opportunity to present information on the subject of the proceeding. Where a proceeding allows for both written submissions and an oral presentation, the intervener may choose to present both orally and in writing, or make a written submission only. So anyone who is a member of the public that appears before the commission or makes a written submission is an intervener. And by extension, your written comments and or your oral presentation are referred to as your intervention. Next slide. So just once again, March 28th is the request to intervene deadline, which means you must send in your written comments to the CNSC by this date. Your request to intervene must include your written submission, a statement setting out how you want to participate. So for example, do you want to participate in writing only, or both in writing and orally? And your name, address, telephone number, and email. Note that you can only request to present orally if you also submit comments in writing. And your written submissions can be as simple or as complex as you'd like. Even something as simple as an email expressing your concerns counts as an intervention. Your request to intervene should be sent to the CNSC at the email address on the slide, or you can also file it online on the CNSC's website. And if you're requesting to present orally at the hearing, the CNSC ultimately has a discretion to grant or deny that request. But if you are given permission, the CNSC will follow up with you directly to schedule your presentation time at the hearing. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Carrie for a discussion about preparing your intervention and getting ready for the hearing.
Thanks so much, Crystal. All right, so now we're at the stage of how do you prepare your comment? And is it in writing? Is it in writing and in person at the hearing? What should you do? So the first step is we recommend to review a number of key documents. So this includes New Brunswick Power's license renewal application, and we've put the link to that in the chat box. It also includes New Brunswick Power's submission to the commission, and also the CNSC staff submission to the commission as well. So there are two documents. So there is the license application, but following that, more recently, NB Power and CNSC staff reviewed the application and said, you know, here's our argument as to why this should or should not be granted. And as Crystal reviewed, the CNSC staff submission did find the license should be granted for a period of 20 years. And so these are formative documents. They're available online, but they are in some ways technical, but don't feel restricted by them. So definitely review them. If there's a concern that you have, a specific environmental or health concern, review those documents to see how your concern is treated. Is it discussed? What do they say? And do you think it's deficient, or is there a gap? Or maybe you feel satisfied and your concern is put to rest. So definitely review these documents, see how your concern is factored into the existing record. And then if it's not there, don't be shy to raise it. A number of the issues that we'll go over in the next couple of slides are issues that don't appear throughout these hearing documents. And so the CNSC and the commission, the commission, they are the same thing, commission and the CNSC, they do rely on input from members of the public to point out where they should be turning their attention to. So once you've reviewed those materials and you've identified your key concerns, now you need to decide, do you only submit comments in writing, and that's due March 28th, or do you submit comments in writing due March 28th and request an opportunity to address the commission during the hearing in the spring? So in kind of making that decision, there's a number of things you can think through. So let's think about what you want to say to the commission, whether in writing or in person. So you want to think about, why is it important? Whether you're appearing for a 10-minute presentation or giving comments in writing, you want to make your comments persuasive. Engage with the commission, tell a story, And you want to connect your concerns to your story. So are you a community member? Do you live nearby? Have you been affected in some way? Or do you have a history, a professional history, or a technical history that connects you to this matter? Or do you have questions for the commission? So maybe you've reviewed the documents and you still have questions. This is your opportunity to ask questions so that the commission can also turn their attention to what might be a gap. And you also want to highlight, in making your submission to the CNSC, you want to highlight the importance and the urgency of this matter. And again, to Crystal's earlier point, that it is unprecedented for a 20-year license to be granted. And so should that happen, should a 20-year license be granted, there won't be an opportunity for us to have this webinar for you to appear in front of the commission for another 20 years. So now is your chance. Even if your comment is simply that 20 years is too long, it should be 5, it should be 1, it should be 2. So then you need to think about what's the key issue. Maybe it's the license length. Maybe you don't think it should be 20 years. Maybe it's about the environment. Maybe it's about climate change. Maybe it's about health. But you want to identify your key issue. And if it's a written comment, you're not restricted by page count. So you can have as many concerns and issues as you like. If it's your oral presentation, typically you have 10 minutes to present. You can ask for more time, but by and large, the trend is 10 minutes to present. So if you're thinking about how to frame your key issue in that presentation of 10 minutes, you might only have time to present 1 or 2 of your main concerns. So in thinking about what are your key issues, you again want to think about what are the purposes of the Nuclear Safety Control Act, what are the powers of the commission, and what can they and can they not do. So again, you're speaking to the commission within the scope of who they are and what they can do. And then the last part we recommend to include are the facts. So, your intervention should contain the background information. So when the commission picks it up to read it, they understand that context. Why is it you're concerned about a certain matter? Set out that background, set out that context. You can include references to literature, to articles. If you think they should see them as well, you can include that within your submission. And then if your written comment is getting quite lengthy, consider having titles and chapters and subheadings and subchapters based on all of those topics, so that your submission in a written form is as accessible as it can be to the commission member who doesn't know your story, and you can present it to them in a persuasive, clear, and compelling way. And with that, we're now going to turn it over to Teresa McClenahan, who is SLAA's Executive Director. And she's just going to run through some suggested topics and how we've approached these in the past to kind of give you a snapshot of what you might want to say in your written or oral presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Carrie. And with that, I will minimize the participants list and I won't see anyone who's trying to get in the room. So I'll let you watch for that. And thanks for putting on the webinar, both of you. I think it's probably very, very helpful to many of the people watching the webinar, because my sense is that in the past, in the Point La Pro licensing, there have not been a large number of public interveners generally, and so for many of you, this may be quite new. So some of the topics that we're thinking about and might be relevant to you as well, depending on your context. One of them is the license length, and both Crystal Ann and Carrie have spoken about how unprecedented that is in Canadian nuclear power plant licensing to this point. For many, many, many years, licenses were typically 2 or 3 years, then they stretched out a little bit to 5 years. Then there was started to be a request for 10 years, which we were very opposed to, because the concern was that civil society, the surrounding public, would start to lose capacity, would no longer know what the issues were at that plant, and would not be able to participate adequately and provide useful material the next time there's a licensing commission. And more fundamentally, because public participation and transparency is absolutely key in respect of this technology. IAEA guidance talks about how transparency is essential in terms of the credibility of the technology and its oversight. Having a 25-year license or a 20-year license means that an entire generation will have no opportunity to look at the operations of the plant in the kind of depth that we can do during license hearings and ask the kinds of questions of the regulator responsible for its oversight that we often see, like some of the following ones. So another topic that's often of concern in the nuclear power plant licensing hearings is whether or not the protection of human health is adequate, and whether or not the emergency response plan is strong enough. And that material is available. The last intervention that SLAA did in, I believe it was 2017, Carrie, if I'm not mistaken, we specifically looked at the issue of the adequacy of emergency planning and especially the public awareness of emergency planning. And we did that in a context where we had gone and looked at those issues in depth at all of the nuclear power plants operating in Canada. And so this was the last one that came up for licensing subsequent to the Fukushima accident. And ironically, we had started returning to that issue and looking in depth in the Darlington and Pickering hearings in Durham region in Ontario just prior to the Fukushima accident. And then that accident occurred while we were in the middle of that environmental assessment and intervention. But these kinds of questions are important. Are the emergency planning zones sufficient that people who need to evacuate would receive notice on time? Do the people who might have to evacuate in the different zones know about it and know where they would go, know how they would get notice? Are people aware of the public alerting system, what it means, where to go for more information? Are people aware in advance of some of the instructions that might be provided and why, as well as things like what might help, like potassium iodide pills, which you would take if there was actually a radiation release, well, preferably just planned, just before it would occur. And it provides some assistance with one particular kind of impact, that is cancer of the thyroid, because it displaces room on your thyroid for the radioactive potassium iodide. But knowing that ahead of time and knowing that taking KI pills a long time ahead of a release, even if an accident is occurring, is not going to help you, or too far later is not going to help you. And asking any questions you might have ahead of time is quite important, and having them on hand so that you can actually utilize them when instructed is quite important. So all of those kinds of questions about the state of the emergency plan and whether the public is aware are good things to look at and inquire about. Because in my view, really key responsibility of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and its staff is to really thoroughly prod and examine the state of that planning and its adequacy. Another topic you could be asking about is the environmental monitoring and environmental protection around the plant. You could be looking at their risk assessment and their safety studies. You could be looking at their routine emissions. So there are various emissions that occur even apart from the context of a potential accident, which we do hope never happens, the accident that is. And sometimes those are, accidental spills to water or other impacts occurring. So those should be monitored, and you should be able to get information about impacts on fish, for example, or on the nearby vegetation and other biota. Similarly, there should be health assessments about the impacts in the area from routine emissions. So if you don't see those, or if you have concerns, you can ask questions about those. And then we have many concerns, and unfortunately they're only growing, around climate impacts on many types of infrastructure, including nuclear power plants. And with rising sea levels, with increased storm surges, with increased very major high wind events, with ice storms, with all kinds of potential impacts, Was the plant originally built to withstand those kinds of impacts? Is the sufficient contingency and buffer and resilience there? That could extend to everything from, height levels of pipes to the robustness of the different structures, and many other aspects. And you might have questions about that, even questions around things like the thermal environment and the impact on fish, which is something that's come up at other plants. And finally, what are your concerns about the post-operating period and decommissioning? And it's quite important at each relicensing to take a look, if you have concerns about those kinds of issues, and see whether they're sufficiently planned, and whether there are any efforts that should be underway now to take care of those issues. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Carrie or Crystal Ann.
Thanks so much, Teresa. So now that Teresa has highlighted some of those areas that you might be concerned about and might want to make your written comment or oral presentation about, how do you actually go about writing this? Like, what's the style? How do you say it to the commission? And so typically what we do at SLAA when we write our submission, we'll have our facts, we'll have the story that sets out why this is important, why this matters. And then at the end, we'll write it as a recommendation to the commission. So we'll tell the story, tell the facts, tell why it matters, and then say, therefore, we recommend, recommendation 1. The CNSC should undertake a review of emergency planning within 30 kilometers. Or maybe we're actually asking a question. So we'll say, we're asking for the CNSC to follow up with MB Power to find out, or we're asking the CNSC to follow up with their staff to understand how such a study, if it's been done, how it's been done. And so having your submission framed with recommendations is just, again, one way to order how you write and make it clear to the commission what specifically you're asking them to do. And then your conclusion is basically, what are you asking the order to be? So the commission, when they issue their written decision, after they deliberate and they take in what they've heard, they will issue a license, and that license is the order. So what will that say? So are you asking for the CNSC to grant the license, deny the license, grant the license but with conditions? What do you think about the length? So this is where you can state, I am requesting that the CNSC deny the license, or in the alternative, grant the license but for only 1 year with the condition that A, B, and C happen. So you want to think about, in a very clear, concise way, what is that overall message you're asking the commission to do? What are you directing them to do at the end of the day? All right, so another little brief recap of some words and links. We will be posting these slides online, so the links will become clickable. But throughout the CNSC proceedings and in emails and on their website, you'll notice this phrase, Commission Member Document, or CMD, and that simply refers to any written remarks or presentations that are submitted, whether it be from a member of the public, CNSC staff, or MB Power. So all of those documents that go into the hearing record are called CMDs. As Crystal mentioned earlier, an intervention is just a fancy word for your written comment. An intervener is a member of the public or a nonprofit group or a citizens group who is looking to actually share something with the commission. All of the interventions, so what you write, what you say, will be publicly available. So your written comment will be posted on the website of the CNSC prior to the hearing, which is great. So you can actually read what other people have said before the hearing happens. So those are usually posted a couple of weeks before the hearing is actually live streamed. And there will be transcripts following the hearing event. So if you can't tune in live on the day, the CNSC does repost the videos, but only for a certain amount of time, but transcripts word by word will be posted. So you can always check the transcripts as well. And as Teresa mentioned, if you are looking for sample interventions of what we've written before, or you're looking for more resources, there is a wealth of nuclear related material on our website at SLAA.ca. You can search for Point La Pro, you could search for nuclear, you could search for CNSC, and any of those search words will turn up many resources for you to review. So last but not least, let's assume all of you here this evening are going to appear at the hearing and you've requested an opportunity to speak. What now to prepare? What's left? So this is the most exciting moment perhaps, because you're not just writing your words, you have to convey them over Zoom, unless the hearing is in person, but it might be a hybrid as well. But at this point, the CNSC is planning for a virtual hearing. So, you know, you have most likely 10 minutes to convey your concerns to the commission. They will follow up with you prior to the hearing to schedule a time. So there will be an agenda. You will know your time slot. Is it in the morning? Is it after lunch? And during your oral presentation, you'll have 10 minutes to present your key concerns. If you want to have a PowerPoint presentation, a few visuals, doesn't have to be complicated. Your PowerPoint is usually due 2 weeks before the hearing, because they will upload that within the meeting, so you don't have to do it. So they just need some time to logistically have the PowerPoint so it can be loaded online, ready to go. After you do your 10-minute presentation, the commission members can ask you questions. So they could say, you know, thank you for your presentation. We see recommendation 4 is asking us to do A, B, and C. Can you please explain why you're asking this? And you know, they can ask you questions that expand on what you've already said to them. So be prepared for questions. But the majority of these questions are actually directed most of the time at MB Power or CNSC staff. So the commission will say, okay, MB Power, we're hearing that SLAA has concerns about emergency planning. Can you please tell us more about something? So be prepared. There will be back and forth dialogue. That is normal. That is usually what happens. And then at the end, after the Q&A, the back and forth dialogue, you might have an opportunity for closing remarks, or, you know, that 1 minute to kind of sum up what you heard, what you want to respond to. Unfortunately, closing remarks isn't yet a required part of the hearing process, although we've been asking for it. So you can always say at the beginning, I'm going to present and I would like the opportunity to provide closing remarks. You can put it out there. So if you have an opportunity for closing remarks, again, a 1 minute summary of your concerns, and perhaps you're responding to some of that Q&A, that back and forth, if you didn't have a chance to interject and to respond to something that was said. So with that,